Welcome back to the second part of our series on Israel. This week, we continue in the Judean desert.
From the bustling coastal cities of Haifa and Akko and the fertile lands around the Sea of Galilee, we're heading south this time and deep into the desert to where the most starkly desolate yet most strikingly beautiful part of the land is found. In this episode, we'll scale the heights of the Judean desert to the fortress walls of Masada and dip in the waters of the Dead Sea in the lowest point of the world. We'll go off-road in the Negev desert to see the largest crater on the planet and try the life of the nomadic Bedouin and travel like they do on camelback. So join us in the south of Israel. I'm David Celdran, and this is Executive Class. You know you're leaving the northern part of Israel when the view of the fertile fields around the Sea of Galilee gives way to the rocky hills and arid landscape in the south of the country. The highway that straddles the border of Jordan also takes you through the disputed occupied territories where tensions between Israeli settlers and Palestinians at the West Bank erupt from time to time.
Okay, we just crossed the checkpoint. We're now in an area called Samaria in the West Bank. And here you'll find the Palestinians. They are the majority population here.
But don't let the fences and checkpoints scare you. Travel along the highway is extremely safe, and the view of the Samarian hillsides and the Judean desert terrain is so incredible, it's more than enough to distract you from the complex conflict in the region.
Right now we're passing through Qumran, which at about 417 meters below sea level is the lowest spot on the earth. It's also where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found.
And before you know it, you're driving above the Dead Sea and deeper across the lowest point of the planet. Dry, desolate, and devoid of most life, it's hard to imagine why anyone, apart from the hermits who kept the Dead Sea Scrolls, would want to live here.
This part of the Judean desert is one of the most inhospitable places in Israel, and that's exactly the reason why King Herod chose it as the location of his fortress. It was supposed to be so remote, no one would dare come near. Of course, they were wrong.
The Rock of Masada, the site of the fabled last stand by rebellious Jewish Sicarii against the Roman army, towers 300 meters above the Dead Sea shore. You can still reach the top on foot, the way the ancients once did, but thanks to the cable car you don't have to. Even by modern cable car standards, that was pretty steep. Imagine what the Romans had to overcome just to get here. Both a royal palace and fortress, Masada also housed a Roman garrison that was attacked by a Jewish cult, the Sicarii, in the year 66 AD. The event sparked the beginning of the Jewish rebellion, eventually crushed by the Romans, culminating in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the exile of Jews from their land. The story goes, remnants of the Sicarii and their families held out in Masada, taking advantage of the thick walls and impossible terrain to survive the prolonged Roman siege.
This entire area here was just for food. It was a food storage area. And one of the reasons why the rebels were able to hold out for so long was because, well, this was once a royal palace, and therefore there was a lot of food here.
Lucky for the Sicarii, Masada was purpose-built to withstand the parched environment. Archaeologists unearthed cisterns that supplied water to the king's court and the heated Roman bathhouse in the royal property.
What a stunning view. Presumably it's the same view that King Herod enjoyed back in the day. Let's not forget, although we know Masada today as a defensive fortress, it was also a pleasure palace. This was where King Herod would come just to get away from it all, like a resort today.
With stunning views like these and vistas that extend to the Dead Sea, you could strip Masada of its historical significance and it would still be worth a visit. But it's a story of resistance, symbolized by Masada, that brings Jews of all ages and from all over the world to relish and relive the heroic events that took place on this summit.
This here is the breaching point. Using a ramp and a battering ram, the Romans finally broke through the wall of Masada. After waiting it out here for 2 years, the rebellion was finally over.
There are conflicting versions of what happened next. In a more popular narrative, the Sicarii opted for mass suicide rather than submit to Roman authority.
This here is a very important part of Masada because it was here that archaeologists found shards of pottery that debunk the myth of a heroic mass suicide that took place here. Apparently not. What happened was the men, women, and children were all murdered by their colleagues to save them from slavery. It was only the last man standing who committed suicide.
Like a lottery, the shards of pottery were used to pick those tasked to do the killing, and the last man standing. But it doesn't matter, does it? The myth of Masada remains as powerful as ever, though sadly abused by some political extremists. Crazy as building a royal residence on Masada might seem, King Herod may have been onto something. His vision was just ahead of its time, actually by 2,000 years, because on the shores of the Dead Sea today you'll find luxury resorts doing much the same thing, even one named after the king. Herod's Hotel is one of a growing number of upscale resorts in Ain Bokek that take advantage of the medicinal qualities produced by the high salinity of the Dead Sea.
The Dead Sea is the lowest sea on the planet. And it's also the saltiest sea there is on the earth. Just imagine this. The water here is 8 times saltier than the ocean, which means if you're planning to take a dip here, make sure your eyes don't get into any contact with the water and definitely don't swallow it. It's really salty, believe me.
The Dead Sea is so called because no living thing can survive the salinity. It's so salty, if you leave a stone under the water long enough, a coat of salt forms over it.
Can't even remove it. It's stuck. So, if I stay long enough in the Dead Sea, I become a pillar of salt. Speaking of which, Sodom and Gomorrah, remember that story? It's close by, the city of Sodom. Strange. You want to know what the water feels like here? Because I can't taste it, but at least I can feel it. It's like baby oil. It's got the texture and the viscosity of baby oil. That's the salt water of the Dead Sea for you.
Take note, this is not a beach for water sports or for swimming. In fact, just stepping on parts of the seashore feel like walking on a bed of rock salt. The trick to enjoying the water is to just lie on your back. The buoyancy produced by the salt content in the water allows you to float effortlessly. Patient bathers are rewarded with the therapeutic nature of the water, said to heal ailments like rheumatism and arthritis. I swear, the oily consistency of the water seems to have softened my skin already. The mud from the seabed is another attraction. The rich mineral deposits found in the mud help clear and moisten the skin. Pretty expensive when bought overseas, you can get it cheap, even free in the Dead Sea.
You know what? I'm not the only one to do this. Over 2,000 years ago, Cleopatra from Egypt used to send her slaves to the Dead Sea to collect mud. She knew back then, like we do now, of their anti-aging properties.
Mud is just one of the many byproducts of the Dead Sea. The seabed contains valuable potash that's used for making fertilizer. But harsh as the environment might seem, it's actually very beautiful here, especially at sundown, when the mist that hangs over the mountains and the sea turn to unusual shades of pastel. This, for me at least, is a true therapy of the Dead Sea. When we return after the break, we'll leave the lowest point on Earth and climb above the world's largest crater, off-road and camelback in the Negev desert when executive class returns.